Welcome to Revolution Chronicles, your home for forgotten history and untold stories. Don't forget to like, share, subscribe, and hit the bell icon so you never miss a chapter from the pasta. Mighty empires stood proud across the seas, yet in the heart of India, its own soldiers turned against it. What followed was betrayal, fire, and a storm that shook the crown itself. The year was 1857, and the empire that stretched across oceans and continents stood proud upon its throne, the British crown. Glittered above all, and beneath it, millions of men and women from distant lands bent their lives into service of a power that called itself eternal. Yet even the mightiest empires are haunted by shadows, shadows that rise not from the enemies they expect but from within their very own ranks, and that year the shadow fell across the British Raj in India. The uprising that erupted across the plains of Hindustan is remembered as the Indian Mutiny, or the First War of Independence by Indians. But hidden within that storm of rebellion lies a tale almost never spoken of, a tale of betrayal from those the crown trusted most: white soldiers. Men who were supposed to be the very guardians of empire, men who carried the blood and pride of Britain in their veins, but who turned their muskets against their own flag too. Understand why such treachery could bloom, we must step into the world of mid-19th century India, a land trembling under the weight of colonial ambition. The East India Company had ruled with greed and arrogance. It squeezed taxes from farmers until fields turned barren. It forced policies that broke old traditions. And it marched an army built on the backs of Indian sepoys, those native soldiers who filled the ranks under British officers. These sepoys fought with discipline and loyalty, yet they lived under suspicion and insult. Their religion mocked their customs. Ignored, the tension was thick, and by 1857 it would ignite like dry straw struck by a match. But what shocked the empire most was not only the sepoys rising, it was the sight of white faces among the rebels. These white mutineers were not imagined phantoms. They were real men, drawn from corners of Britain and Ireland, from Scotland's rugged glens, from the streets of London and the farms of Wales. Many had come to India as common soldiers, underpaid, underfed, and often despised by their own officers. Some were drunkards, some were dreamers, some were deserters running from debts or shame at home. All of them carried muskets in the service of the crown, but their loyalty was paper-thin beneath their red coats. Their hearts beat with restlessness and despair. The life of a soldier in India was no golden post. It was heat and disease. It was endless drill. It was watching officers feast while the men boiled in rags in barracks across. Bengal discontent simmered when whispers of rebellion began to spread through the sepoys. The white soldiers heard them too. They shared bread with these men. They marched beside them. They learned their tongues, and in the darkness of night, when rank and punishment were forgotten, they heard the bitterness that rose from sepoy lips, the rumor that cartridges for the new Enfield rifles were greased with cow and pig fat. An insult to both Hindu and Muslim faiths was the final spark, the sepoys muttered, of betrayal by the crown, and some of the white soldiers found themselves nodding along. They too knew betrayal, not of faith, perhaps, but of class. Of blood spilled cheaply for officers who called them scum, of generals who forgot them the moment battle ended. And so in the sweltering spring of 1857, when the flames of mutiny first leaped high in Meerut, a handful of white men chose to cross the line. Some did it in rage after lashings from cruel officers, some in fear of the mob that threatened to kill any who stayed loyal, some in hope of freedom promised by the rebels. Some simply hated the empire enough to see it fall, and when they turned their coats, they gave the rebellion more than just bodies. They gave it a terrifying symbol. The empire's own flesh had turned against itself. Then the beginning, the numbers were small. A corporal from Dublin shot his sergeant and rode out with a company of sepoys. An English gunner opened the gates of a magazine to the rebels. A Scottish infantryman threw down his rifle and shouted with the mutineers that no man should fight for masters who spat on his name. Each story spread like wildfire. exaggerated and repeated until the whole of India seemed to believe that bands of white traders roamed the countryside. Standing shoulder to shoulder with sepoys against the crown, for the British officers, the thought was poison if a sepoy mutiny was bad. A betrayal by white men was unbearable. It struck at the very heart of what the empire was supposed to mean. The truth was tangled. Some white soldiers joined willingly. Others were forced at sword point, captured when garrisons fell, and given the choice of death or rebellion. Yet, even when forced, many stayed. They found among the rebels something they had never felt under British command, a strange equality, not of respect perhaps, but of shared struggle. They drank the same water, marched the same dusty roads, and when bullets flew, they fought side by side. Some married Indian women in those fevered months, some wrapped turbans around their heads and swore oaths in languages their fathers never spoke. The Crown would later try to erase them, blot them from history books, declare them madmen or cowards, but eyewitnesses saw them. They saw pale faces among the sepoys firing from ramparts at Kanpur. They saw blue eyes glinting in the smoke at Lucknow. They saw fair hair matted with sweat as men raised rebel flags upon captured forts. The betrayal was undeniable, and it cut deeper because it was not the sepoys alone, but Britain's own flesh and blood that had rebelled in Kanpur. The horror was thick. General Wheeler's garrison, besieged by Nana Sahib's forces, found itself betrayed not only by sepoys, but by white men who had abandoned their oath. One such man, an Irish artilleryman, guided rebel gunners, showing them how to load and aim with deadly precision. It was his shot that tore through the British defenses, his knowledge that turned Indian guns into weapons of terror for those trapped inside the entrenchment. The thought that a fellow European fired upon them was unbearable. A British woman wrote later that she could not believe her eyes when she saw a white man standing among the enemy, laughing as cannon fire tore through tents and bodies for her. It was not just treachery, it was an abomination. The siege of Lucknow bore its tales when rebels swarmed the residency, and the city groaned under months of fighting. Whispers grew of English deserters training the rebels, teaching them drills, shouting orders in the very accent of home. To hear commands in one's own tongue coming from the enemy lines was enough to freeze the blood. Officers fumed that their own discipline, their own methods were turned against them, and the rebels laughed that the Crown's power was not so absolute if its own children would betray it. Who were these men really? Some were deserters, long before the mutiny, men who had slipped into the countryside years earlier, taken up work as mercenaries or bodyguards or simple wanderers. When rebellion came, they returned with old grudges and burning hopes. Some were captured during early outbreaks and swayed by promises of gold or life spared. Others truly believed the empire deserved to fall. They spoke of Ireland's wounds of famine and English cruelty. They spoke of poverty in London's streets, of children dying while the empire fattened itself on India's wealth. For them to fire upon the Union Jack was not betrayal, it was justice. The British command responded with fury. Any white man captured fighting among the rebels was shown no mercy. Courts-martial were brief, and the gallows quick. Men were hanged in rows from the branches of mango trees, their bodies left as warnings across the countryside. Some were blown from cannons, their limbs scattered to the winds. The empire would tolerate no stain upon its own, but even in death, these men carried a dreadful weight. For if rebellion could touch them, it could touch anyone. And so the story of the white traitors grew. It became a whisper in London's drawing rooms, a fear in Calcutta's clubs, a secret that officers hated to admit. The empire was built on loyalty, on the belief that its soldiers, white and brown alike, would hold the line. Yet in 1857, that belief cracked. The Indian Mutiny was not only a rising of sepoys, but a mirror held up to Britain itself, showing the cracks in its own armor. The white traitors proved that empire was fragile, that its heart could bleed from within. As the rebellion spread, villages burned, cities shook, the Ganges ran red with blood, and everywhere the question lingered, who could be trusted anymore? No one knew how many white men had joined the rebels. Some said dozens, some swore hundreds, but the fear was larger than the truth. Every pale face was suspect, every drunkard soldier, every man with shifty eyes. The empire began to look inward at its own men and wonder if the crown's glory was nothing more than a mask about to slip away. This was the world of 1857, a world where empire cracked under the weight of betrayal, where the line between loyalty and treason blurred in the dust and smoke of rebellion, and where Britain's own sons turned their rifles not upon the sepoys they commanded, but upon the empire that claimed to own them, a wound so deep that history itself tried to bury it. Yet the truth still lingers, a reminder that no empire, no matter how mighty, can stand forever when its own children become its traitors. The heat of the summer bore down on the plains of India, and with it, the rebellion spread like a storm without mercy. Town after town fell into chaos. Garrisons that once stood proud and scarlet were reduced to ash and smoke, and everywhere whispers of treachery clung to the air like a fever. In Delhi, the ancient city of emperors, the mutiny reached its fiercest cry, and at its heart, white men were seen among the ranks of the insurgents. It was not just the sepoys who raised muskets beneath the crumbling arches of the Mughal capital, but pale-skinned deserters, their faces blackened with gunpowder, their tongues shouting in English and Irish curses as they turned their fire upon the very men they once called brothers. Delhi had always been more than a city. It was the symbol of India's soul, and when the mutineers seized it, proclaiming the frail Bahadur Shah Zafar as their figurehead emperor, the crown knew it faced not just rebellion, but revolution. The siege that followed was long and bloody. British forces clawed at the city gates, while inside sepoys and citizens stood defiant, but within those battered walls lived the stories the empire tried to deny. Men spoke of a white artilleryman who manned the cannons on the Kashmiri Gate, sending shot after shot into British lines. His aim was said to be deadly, his laughter cruel, each blast a reminder that one of their own now sought their destruction. His comrades were sepoys, but they called him brother, and when his cannon roared, they roared with him. Not far from him, others were seen, pale faces, wrapped in turbans, moving among the mutineers, giving advice on drill, on musket handling, on the very tactics they had learned in service of the crown. These men had once drilled on the parade grounds of Calcutta or marched in columns through the dusty roads of Bengal. Now they used those lessons to strengthen the rebellion. To hear orders shouted in a familiar accent from across enemy lines was a torment. To the British officers who listened through spyglasses and disbelief, they cursed these traitors with every breath, yet feared them more than they admitted. For if the sepoys had skill, it was sharpened by these white rebels who knew the empire's Waza Kanpur. The nightmare reached its deepest darkness. Nana Sahib, the adopted son of a Maratha prince, led the rebels there, and his name still drips with both terror and legend. For the besieged Europeans trapped in Wheeler's entrenchment, each day brought hunger, thirst, and endless fire. They were surrounded, and within the ranks of the enemy they saw faces they had never expected. A sergeant's wife recalled through broken tears how she glimpsed a fair-haired gunner among the mutineers. He was shouting to aim lower, to cut through the defenses with greater precision. He was no sepoy pressed into service, he was one of their own, a man who had once sworn to defend the Union Jack. She could not understand how his heart had turned so black. Some of these men fought for coin. Nana Sahib was said to have promised gold and land to those who fought well, but some fought for reasons far more bitter. An Irish soldier named Patrick was whispered to have stood with the sepoys, declaring that he would rather die than fight for the English crown that starved his people back home. He spat upon the name of Queen Victoria and swore that the only lus testis he knew was in seeing Britain's empire burn for him. India's rebellion was not foreign, it was a mirror of Ireland's sorrow, and he embraced it as vengeance long delayed. The horrors that followed at Kanpur are etched in history, bloodied beyond belief, the slaughter of women and children after promises of safe passage. remains one of the darkest stains upon the uprising, and in its shadow, the image of white rebels grew even darker. For to imagine Europeans not only standing with the mutineers but taking part in such butchery was almost beyond endurance, yet witnesses swore they saw them, and though history blurred the truth, the belief alone was enough to turn the stomach of every officer in the British camp. The white traitors became demons in the imagination of Empire, unholy figures whose betrayal seemed worse than the cruelty of the massacre itself. Mutiny spread, other stories rose. In Bareilly, in Jhansi, in the dusty towns of the Ganges, plain pale-skinned men appeared like ghosts. Some had grown beards and wrapped themselves in local garb, blending into the rebel host. Others strutted openly, defiant, their red coats stripped of insignia, their muskets raised high as if to declare to the Empire itself that loyalty had died. The British who fought against them could hardly bear the sight. To be fired upon by sepoys was expected, but to see a man with blue eyes steady a musket and fire at you was a wound that no bandage could heal. Why did they do it? Why would men born under the Union Jack cast aside all and turn to treachery? The answers are as varied as the men themselves. Some were men of broken spirit, weary of lash and hunger and endless heat. They had been flogged, humiliated, discarded by officers who valued them less than the horses they rode. They saw no reason to die for such masters, and when the chance came, they chose to fight against them. Others were driven by dreams or vengeance. Men from Ireland who carried the memory of famine, men from England's slums who knew only poverty and chains, men who looked at India's struggle and saw their own pain reflected back at them still. Others were simply swept along, captured in the fall of garrisons, and given no choice but death or defection. Some may have told themselves they would escape when the chance arose, yet days turned to weeks and weeks to months, and soon they were no longer prisoners, but brothers in arms. The line between captive and comrade blurred, and in the dust of rebellion, the choice became permanent. For the British command, the presence of these traitors was more than just a tactical wound. It was a spiritual one. The Empire had built itself upon the myth of unity, that white men would always stand together as rulers, and that their superiority was unquestioned. But when pale-skinned men stood shoulder to shoulder with sepoys, that myth cracked into shards. It whispered that empire was not as eternal as it claimed. It showed that even the proudest crown could be betrayed, not by strangers, but by its own children. The punishments were savage. When British forces retook towns and captured these traitors, they made examples of them. With ropes and gallows, with cannons and rifles, they sent messages written in blood. A white deserter caught in Delhi was dragged before the troops. His crime shouted aloud before he was tied to a cannon and blasted into pieces. Another in Lucknow was hanged slowly, the crowd forced to watch as his body swung as a lesson to all who might follow. He cried out with his last breath that Britain itself was the traitor, and the hush that followed his death was deeper than silent sand. Yet despite the fury, despite the punishment, the whispers did not stop. The rebels treasured these men, some for their skill, some simply because their very presence mocked the Empire. They would shout across the battlefield, asking the British how it felt to be betrayed by their own. They held up captured muskets of white deserters as trophies. They made legends out of them, men who were said to fight with reckless courage, as if eager to prove they belonged to the cause. And in British camps, officers tightened their lips and refused to speak of them, fearing the story would rot the spirit of their Manema. The rebels, the sight of these traitors inspired awe. If the Empire's own flesh could rebel, then perhaps victory was possible. They were symbols, living proof that the crown's power was not divine, but fragile. Their pale faces shone like cracks in the fortress of empire, and the sepoys looked upon them with something close to reverence. Even when their numbers were small, their meaning was vast. They stood not as hundreds, but as shadows stretching long across the imagination of all who fought through the monsoon rains. The struggle raged on. The Ganges Valley shook with the roar of cannon. The sky blackened with smoke, villages turned into charnel houses, and cities into fields of ruin, and through it all, the ghost of betrayal lingered. Men could not sleep without dreaming of it, could not march without fearing it, could not die without cursing it. The white traitors of 1857 had become a wound that no empire could cleanse by. Autumn, the rebellion still raged, though the tide had begun to shift. British reinforcements poured in from across the seas, fresh regiments eager for vengeance. But even as the crown tightened its grip, the memory of betrayal burned bright for the sepoys, who still fought. The sight of pale faces among their comrades reminded them that their cause was just for the British who marched to reclaim their empire. It was a constant whisper of dread that the line between loyalty and treason was thinner than they ever wished to believe. The mutiny was no longer just a war of sepoy against crown. It was a war that reached into the very heart of what empire meant, a war where even those born to serve the crown turned their muskets against it, and where the very meaning of loyalty was drowned in blood and smoke. The empire would win battles. It would retake cities, but it would never erase the shame that its own men had stood against it. Never wash clean the stain of treachery that dripped from Delhi to Kanpur to Lucknow. The rebellion of 1857 was more than an uprising. It was a mirror held before Britain, and in that mirror it saw not only the faces of its sepoys, but the faces of its own soldiers, twisted with rage and defiance. And in that reflection, it saw its own downfall, though it would take decades to come, for no empire built on betrayal can last forever, and the white traitors of India proved that truth in blood. The rains had passed, and with them the earth of India turned to mud, roads washed away, and rivers swelled high. Yet still the sound of gunfire and cannon shook the skies. The rebellion had not died as the British had hoped. It had grown roots deep into the soil, and those roots were watered not only by sepoy blood, but by the strange and terrible loyalty of white men who had abandoned their flag. By the autumn of 1857, these traitors were no longer just scattered deserters. They had become symbols. They haunted every battlefield, every campfire tale, every whisper among the ranks of both sides. For the British, they were a nightmare. For the rebels, they were a strange kind of miracle. In the city of Lucknow, the siege dragged on month after month. Within the battered residency, British men, women, and children clung to life behind walls cracked with cannon fire. The air stank of sweat and death, and the cries of the wounded never ceased. Day after day, the rebels hurled their fury upon the defenders, and among them voices were heard that did not belong to India, but to Britain itself. Men who spoke English without accent, men who once drilled in scarlet, but now shouted orders for the enemy. They were not ghosts, but flesh and blood. Traitors commanding batteries, teaching sepoys how to lay their fire with deadly accuracy. To hear a man bark orders in the tongue of your own country, yet watch as his shot tore through your defenses, was a cruelty no heart could bear. Women wept in disbelief, soldiers cursed through their teeth, officers gritted their jaws, refusing to believe what their eyes told them. But the truth was plain. Their own men were among the enemy. One of the most whispered stories of Lucknow was of a man called William, an Englishman said to have deserted years before, who lived now like a native with beard grown long and turban wrapped tight. He was seen standing upon the ramparts, musket in hand, shouting in Hindi to the sepoys beside him. Yet when British troops drew near in their desperate sallies, he was heard laughing in English, taunting them, calling them cowards and dogs. His very existence was a wound to the defenders, a reminder that loyalty was no chain, and that even the sons of England could spit upon the crown. When the chance arose, the rebellion gave these men a stage upon which they were larger than life. In reality, perhaps their numbers were small, but their effect was enormous, for in the minds of the British they multiplied with every rumor. If one was seen at Lucknow, then surely 10 more waited in Delhi. If another fought at Kanpur, then 100 must lurk in Jhansi. The fear of betrayal became almost as deadly as the bullets that flew. The empire thrived on certainty. On a clear line between ruler and ruled, But the presence of these white traitors blurred that line until nothing seemed safe anymore. Jansi herself stood as a beacon of defiance, led by the legendary Rani, who fought like a lioness to defend her. Her armies were filled with sepoys and villagers, yet among them stories tell of pale-skinned faces, men who had once fought beneath the Union Jack but now swore oaths of loyalty to the Queen of Jhansi. It was said that one of her gunners was a Scotsman, his brogue unmistakable. Even when he cursed in Hindi, he had once been flogged near to death by his British sergeant, and now he took his vengeance with every shot fired upon the enemy. His presence beside the Rani was more than useful. It was symbolic, for if even the sons of Britain could rally to her banner, then surely her cause was just in the eyes of the gods. The empire reeled under these stories, and when reinforcements poured in from Britain from the far corners of empire, they came not only to crush the sepoys, but to cleanse the shame of treachery. The white mutineers were hunted with a fury unmatched. They were declared outlaws beyond mercy and beyond redemption. Officers swore that no man of pale face found among the rebels would ever see trial, but would instead be cut down without hesitation. And so when cities fell, the vengeance was savage in Delhi. When the city was finally retaken by British bayonets, the hunt for traitors was merciless among the rubble. And bloodmen searched for faces that did not belong to the natives, and when they found them, no mercy was given. Some were dragged into the streets, shot on the spot their bodies left for crows. Others were strung up by ropes on the nearest tree. Signs hung around their necks, declaring them traitors to the crown, and their corpses swung in the hot wind like warnings carved in flesh. One officer recorded in his diary that it was not the sepoys who disgusted him most, but the English deserters. For they had no excuse, no faith to defend, no custom to cling to, only treachery and greed. He wrote that their death was not justice, but a cleansing of filth. Yet, even as they were hunted, their legend grew stronger in the bazaars of Delhi. Mothers hushed their children with tales of pale-skinned rebels who fought for freedom. Men whispered that these white soldiers had thrown away wealth and privilege to stand with the oppressed, that perhaps not all white men were the tools of empire, that maybe, just maybe, a new brotherhood could rise across the lines of race and faith, built not on chains but on rebellion. These were dangerous ideas to the British, and so the memory of these men was smothered wherever possible. Official records ignored them, newspapers downplayed them, and in years to come the story was brushed aside as rumor, yet the witnesses knew they had seen them, and their memory could not be erased. The months of 1858 brought more battles, more blood. Jhansi fell, Gwalior burned, and across the plains the rebellion staggered under the weight of British reinforcements. But even as the tide turned, the white traitors remained. The last whispers told of them fleeing with rebel bands into the jungles, hiding among villages, taking new names and vanishing into the dust. Perhaps some were killed in battle, their bodies lost among the countless dead. Perhaps others survived, marrying into the land, building new lives far from the empire that had once owned them. In truth, no one knows, for the empire did all it could to bury them in silence. But silence cannot erase the questions they left behind. Questions that gnawed at the heart of Britain's pride. For if even a handful of its own soldiers could betray the crown, then what did that say of empire itself? Could loyalty be forced? Could an empire built on lash and hunger truly last? If pale-skinned men could look upon India's struggle and see their own reflection, then perhaps the empire was not destiny, but delusion. And in those questions lay the seeds of doubt, seeds that would grow for decades until the empire itself began to crumble among the rebels. Their names became half-remembered legend. Songs whispered of the white gunners at Delhi, the Irishmen at Kanpur, the Scotsmen at Jhansi. Tales grew taller with each telling. Some said there were hundreds of them, whole companies of Europeans who marched with the rebels. Some claimed they had raised their own banners and sworn oaths of freedom in languages mingled from east and west. Perhaps the truth was smaller, but the myth was larger, and sometimes myths matter more than numbers. For in the memory of India, the image of white traders fighting against empire stood as proof that the struggle was not alone, that even within the heart of Britain there were men who knew the taste of oppression and chose to fight against it. And so by the time the rebellion was crushed by 1859, with its leaders hanged or exiled, with cities rebuilt in blood and fire, the white traders were already ghosts, their names scratched out from rolls, their deeds buried under silence. Yet in the shadows of empire, their story remained carried in whispers, by survivors spoken in half-tones, by officers who dared admit the truth. The empire had been wounded not just by sepoys, but by its own men, and though it claimed victory, it carried that scar forever. For the Empire of Britain was built upon loyalty, upon the certainty that its men would never turn, that its blood would always remain pure. Yet in 1857, that certainty was shattered forever. A few pale faces in the smoke of rebellion had proven that no empire, no matter how strong, could demand loyalty when it gave none in return. They had proven that betrayal comes not from the weak, but from those who have been pushed too far, and in their betrayal, they left a legacy more dangerous than any battle. They left the truth that empire itself is a fragile thing held together only by obedience, and when obedience breaks, the crown itself begins to crack. The rebellion was crushed, but the echo of those traitors carried far across the seas, to London, to Dublin, to Edinburgh, where men read the reports in newspapers and wondered if the empire they praised was truly as eternal as it claimed. Perhaps in dark taverns in Ireland, men raised glasses to the memory of Patrick, the Irish rebel, who turned his musket against the crown. Perhaps in Scotland, old soldiers whispered of the lad who had once worn tartan, but chose instead to stand with Jauncey's queen. Perhaps in England itself, the poor who starved in the shadows of wealth wondered if maybe they too might one day turn against the empire that ignored them. History tried to bury them, but truth cannot be buried forever, and the tale of the crown's traitors lives still in the margins of rebellion, a reminder that even within the ranks of empire, there are cracks where light can break through, a reminder that loyalty is not eternal, and that when men are broken, betrayed, and cast aside, they may yet rise even against their own flag. The sun over northern India in the summer of 1858 was heavy and merciless. Its white glare lay across the ruins of homes, the broken barracks, the shattered mosques and temples, the burnt bazaars, and it seemed to settle like a curse upon the land. The mutiny that had begun with whispers and sudden sparks a year before was now a full storm, and yet it was also breaking apart, crushed in places, revived in others, and leaving behind a trail of sorrow that no man could ignore. The soldiers of the East India Company, who had turned their rifles against the crown, were hunted from city to city, field to field, corner to corner, yet their defiance refused to die in Delhi, the seat of the old Mughal throne. British cannons thundered against the ancient walls. The defenders were not just sepoys, they were merchants, bakers, smiths, students, farmers, men who had taken up the sword and musket alongside the rebel soldiers, believing that Delhi represented the heart of India, and that if it stood free, all India might breathe free with it. But within those same walls, hunger, sickness, and betrayal also crept. Soldiers who had once been disciplined and proud were now reduced to fighting over crumbs and drinking foul water from broken wells. Some deserted, others surrendered, yet still others fought on with eyes burning with the fire of lost honor. When at last British troops stormed the breaches of Delhi, street by street was drenched in blood, houses were smashed open, the old Mughal court was dragged down. The Emperor Bahadur Shah Zafar, old, frail, and weary, was taken as a prisoner, and the city that had been called the Jewel of the East was left in ashes. Even with Delhi fallen, the fire did not end in Lucknow. The fighting grew savage, and endless British families trapped in the Residency clung to life behind sandbags and ruined walls, while sepoy rebels and townsfolk rained musket fire and cannon shot upon them day after day, week after week. The siege dragged on, and both sides suffered horrors beyond words inside the Residency. Children starved, women wasted away, and men fell at their posts. Outside, the rebels lost thousands to British shells and bayonets, and yet still they returned, still they fired, still. They dug trenches closer and closer. The city became a place where hope and despair walked hand in hand, and where men on both sides whispered that God himself had abandoned them. When relief finally came, it was no relief at all, for Lucknow bled again in wave after wave until the streets ran dark in Kanpur. The name alone became a shadow upon the British soul. What had begun as promises of safe passage turned into a nightmare that would never be forgotten: the massacre at the Bibigar, where women and children were cut down in despair, was burned into the memory of every Englishman who lived through those times, and it became the cry of vengeance that carried British bayonets deeper into India. But if Kanpur was horror for the British, it was also horror for the rebels, for once British troops returned, their fury knew no bounds. Villages were torched, men were hanged in rows, and the rope and the gallows became as common as the musket and cannon. War stripped away every layer of mercy and left only bitterness behind. Across the countryside, rebellion flickered in countless villages. Some rose with the rebels, believing their gods, their honor, their land demanded it. Others cowered before British reprisals, afraid to speak, afraid to choose. There were sepoys who deserted their officers, yet later returned to their ranks, and there were British loyalists who, in the dark of night, betrayed comrades to the rebels. No man could tell friend from foe with certainty. The lines blurred until war became less about sides and more about survival. And still, within this storm of cruelty and revenge, there remained the haunting truth that many of the men who now stood on opposite ends of the battlefield had once marched together, eaten from the same pot, laughed around the same fires. A British sergeant might find himself facing a sepoy who only months earlier had drilled under his command. An officer might be cut down by the very soldier he once praised for loyalty. The bonds of trust built over decades were torn apart, and in their place grew a bitterness that could never be mended. This betrayal cut deeper than any wound of war, for it showed that empire was built not on stone, but on fragile ties of fear and obedience, and once those ties were broken, nothing could hold it firm. By the spring of 1859, the great uprising had been beaten back, town by town, fortress by fortress, village by village. The British poured fresh regiments from across the seas. Highlanders from Scotland, Irish regiments hardened by famine survivors, artillery from London, cavalry from the colonies. They marched with iron will, determined to crush the last embers of defiance. The rebels fought on in scattered bands, some under leaders like Tancha Tope, who carried the flame of resistance through jungles and across plains, yet one by one they fell. Betrayed, captured, or broken by exhaustion, the mutiny that had once threatened to sweep an empire away was drowned in fire and blood. But though the crown reclaimed India, the victory was no triumph, for behind it lay a land scarred forever. Villages, burnt crops, ruined families, shattered temples, defiled, and thousands upon thousands of graves, silent beneath the dust. This company that had ruled India with profit and cruelty for more than a century was dissolved, swept away in disgrace. The British government in London took direct rule into its own hands, declaring that India was now a possession of the crown. Yet, even as Queen Victoria's proclamation promised justice and mercy, every man who lived through the mutiny knew the truth: India would never be the same, and neither would Britain. For among the British themselves, doubt had taken root. They had seen their own soldiers rise against them. They had witnessed loyalty turn into defiance. They had felt the cost of betrayal, and though they might bury the bones and rebuild the forts, they could never forget how easily the empire had trembled the crowns. Men had fought against her, and in doing so, they had shown the world that no empire, no matter how mighty, is unshakable. Older men who survived the mutiny carried its ghosts with them to their graves. Some spoke of comrades they lost, others spoke of horrors they wished to forget, and many kept silent, for silence was the only way to live with memory. In India, songs were sung of brave men who rose against foreign masters even as gallows were raised in their villages. In Britain, poems and histories painted the rebellion as a storm of savagery. Yet beneath the words, there remained unease, a quiet knowledge that if such defiance could rise once, it might rise again. So the story of the Crown's traitors remained a wound not easily healed. It was a story of betrayal and courage, of loyalty and treachery, of blood spilled between men who had once stood shoulder to shoulder. It was a reminder that power can command obedience, but never the heart, and that when the heart rebels, armies tremble. For those who lived through it, the memory lingered like smoke after a fire. For those who came after it was a warning carved in history, that even the strongest empire could be shaken from within, not by foreign armies, not by distant enemies, but by its very own Menand. That is why the Mutiny of 1857 stands not just as an Indian rebellion, but as a moment when Britain, self, was forced to see its reflection, a reflection cracked and darkened by the betrayal of its own.